My name is Shelby McGee. I'm the Deputy Director of the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Very honored to be a part of this event. Okay, and we've got our speakers and their microphones. Great. I just want to add that I am a Jewish American woman, so I really appreciate the focus of today on Israel and Ukraine, but as Katya mentioned, I did just return from Ukraine. We're going to turn to this panel looking at a vision for the future after war, but I also just want to make a note following the last panel that we still are in this war and how the war ends matters. So following the focus on the humanitarian, I do want to say that while I was in Ukraine, there was a lot of discussion about peace negotiations, prospects for peace, but I spent time in the bomb shelter because Russia continued to attack Ukraine almost every night and every day. And those of you that know Jewish mothers can imagine the text messages that I was getting. And then I want to acknowledge that even just this Sunday night, you continue to see the stories about peace prospects. Are we getting there? But Russia directed 150 drones just at the Kyiv region, and a 27-year-old mother, Anna, covered her 4-year-old son, Mark, with her body to protect him during the attack. She was killed. Mark was injured in his face. He's at the hospital. They're trying to save his vision, and his grandparents are also injured in the hospital. I think it's important when we're talking about this that, as our last panel said, we bring up the human aspect. So that's how I see how Putin is approaching peace, and the Ukrainian people truly want peace. And when we're talking about peace, I think it's important to remember that that is territorial integrity, sovereignty, and also prosperity. And that's where this panel comes in. Ukraine has a right to be free and also to grow. And I see a lot of potential for the US and Ukraine to grow together. And I think Russia sees that as a threat. So with that, I'd like to turn it to our panel to talk about these issues. What key points you think the audience need to keep in mind for a post-war Ukraine, for Ukraine now, and anything else you want to end the event with, as you are the last panel. It's now my honor to introduce our distinguished panel. Ambassador Herbst, you've heard from, but he'll be joining us again. And then we have Vadym Melnyk, a high-ranking civil servant and expert in economic security, criminal and administrative law. He has over 25 years of experience in law enforcement, fiscal and analytical agencies, and advanced from a junior investigator to head of the State Fiscal Service of Ukraine. From 2021 to 2023, he served as the first director of the Bureau of Economic Security of Ukraine, where he laid the foundation for a new model of combating economic crimes, intelligence-led policing. And then we've got Matt London, a seasoned international business executive with much experience, including at the U.S. Department of Commerce, and now he is an affiliated research at the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University's Walsh School of Foreign Service. So Vadym, I'd like to turn to you for any opening remarks on this important topic.
Шановні друзі, шановні учасники молитовного сніданку, я хотів би виступити нашою патріотичною мелодійною українською мовою за допомогою перекладача.
Dear friends, dear guests, dear participants of the prayer breakfast, I would like to deliver my speech in a patriotic way in Ukrainian with the help of my assistants and translator.
Я дуже радий вітати вас від імені українського народу.
I'm very happy to greet you on behalf of the Ukrainian people.
Насамперед, я щиро дякую організаторам та партнерам цього заходу, завдяки яким ми маємо змогу бути разом.
First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers and partners of this event. That's what bringing us together.
І особливо подяка конгресмену Марку Гріну та пану Роберту Ілатову за їхню підтримку та відданість справі.
And special thanks to the Congressman Mark Green and Mr. Robert Ilatov for their steadfast support and commitment to this cause.
Для мене велика честь виступати саме тут, у серці американської демократії.
It's a great honor for me to be here in the heart of the American democracy.
Ми, українці, як ніколи відчуваємо цінність віри, гідності та солідарності.
We Ukrainians now more than ever feel and deeply value faith, dignity and solidarity.
У цей час, коли ворог намагається зламати нас не лише ракетами, а й страхом, ми залишаємося вірними свободі, гідності і нашому життю.
These days, when our enemy is trying to break us down not only with the missiles but also with fear, we remain committed to fight, and we believe in freedom, dignity, and life.
Але сьогодні я хотів би розповісти вам не про жертву, а про силу.
But today, I would like to talk to you not about the victimhood, but about strengths.
Про те, як навіть у найтемніші часи наш народ не втрачає віри.
About how even during the darkest moments, our Ukrainian people are not losing their faith.
Я особисто бачив, як мирна Буча під Києвом у 22-му стала символом звірства і водночас людської стійкості.
I personally witnessed how a peaceful city of Bucha in 2022 became a symbol not only of brutality but also of human resilience.
Я особисто бачив очі людей, які втратили все, але не втратили здатність боротися.
I personally saw the eyes of people who lost everything but did not lose their will to fight.
До речі, я так само там живу.
By the way, this is where I live as well.
І я знаю, ворог помилився, нас не зламати.
And I know for sure that the enemy made a mistake and we cannot be broken.
Коли український народ намагаються поневолити, ми даємо обов'язково відсіч і не лише на фронті, а у кожній сфері, від культури до економіки.
When somebody is trying to enslave the Ukrainian people, we fight back, and not only in the battlefield, but in the areas of culture and economy.
На економічному фронті, де я маю честь працювати, кожен мій крок був і залишається спрямованим на захист фінансової стійкості нашої держави.
On the economic front where I work, my every step is determined to be focused on the strengthening of nation's financial stability.
Мій досвід у податковій службі та в управлінні Бюро економічної безпеки України навчив мене. Бюджет – це не лише цифри.
My experience in the tax service of Ukraine and heading the Bureau for Economic Security has taught me one thing, that budget is not just the numbers.
Бюджет – це про силу армії, про школи, які мають працювати, про довіру громадян.
The budget is about the army, about the functioning of the schools, and about the trust of the public.
Сьогодні ключовими пріоритетами економічної безпеки залишаються
Today, key economic priorities of Ukraine include
детінізація економіки,
bringing the shadow economy into light,
боротьба з фінансовими злочинами,
combating financial crimes,
прозорість державних закупівель.
ensuring the transparency of the public procurement.
Дуже важливо сьогодні для України недопущення виведення капіталу за кордон
And it's extremely important for Ukraine to prevent the withdrawal of the capital abroad
і підтримка доброчесного бізнесу.
and supporting honest businesses.
Так як кожна гривня в тіньовій економіці – це втрачені можливості для нашої перемоги.
Because every hryvnia and every dollar lost into the shadow economy is a lost opportunity for our victory.
Україна сьогодні не лише обороняється, вона і створює.
But Ukraine is not only defending today, Ukraine is also creating.
Українська економіка навіть під обстрілами живе.
Even under the bombing and shelling, Ukrainian economy is living.
IT-компанії впроваджують інновації, фермери сіють, підприємці працюють і платять податки.
IT companies are innovating, farmers are sowing, and entrepreneurs are paying taxes and keeping people employed.
І це на сьогодні героїзм зовсім іншого рівня. І він має бути поміченим, саме цей героїзм нашої України.
And this is a heroism of a completely different level, completely different dimension, and I insist that it needs to be seen and acknowledged.
Україна на сьогодні має величезний потенціал, і я хочу поділитися конкретними прикладами.
For the moment, Ukraine still has an enormous potential, and I would like to give you several examples.
Наш IT-сектор – один із найдинамічніших у світі.
Our IT sector is one of the fastest growing in the world.
Тисячі українських стартапів створюють продукти, що конкурують на глобальному ринку.
Thousands of Ukrainian startups are creating the products which are already competitive in the world market.
Агропромисловий комплекс України може стати годувальником не лише Європи, а й всього світу.
Our agricultural complex has the capacity to feed not only Europe, but the whole world.
Наша зелена енергетика, яка потужно розвивається, має всі шанси і весь потенціал вивести нас у лідери відновлюваних джерел енергії.
And our green energy, which is developing very fast, has the real potential to make Ukraine a leader in this area as well.
І це я кажу про конкретні напрямки, які ми готові розвивати разом з вами, з нашими партнерами.
And I'm talking about concrete directions which we can develop jointly with our partners.
Водночас ми не можемо ігнорувати виклики.
Of course, simultaneously, we cannot ignore the challenges.
Війна продовжує накладати тягар на кожного українця. Інфраструктура руйнується, родини зазнають втрат, економіка перебуває під тиском.
The war continues to weigh heavily on Ukrainians. The infrastructure is being damaged, the family experience heavy losses, and the economy is under pressure.
Україна сьогодні дійсно втрачає молодь. Не через байдужість, а через прагнення безпеки.
And Ukraine is also losing its young people, but it's not because of indifference, but because they are seeking more security.
Але ми не маємо права сьогодні ділити українців, які тут чи які там. Не маємо цього робити права.
But we have no right to impose these division lines amongst Ukrainians who are here in Ukraine or those who are there abroad. We have no right to do that.
Ми повинні створити такі умови, і це зараз робиться на рівні держави нашої України, щоб кожен, хто вже виїхав, він захотів сам повернутися до безпечної, гідної, сучасної України.
We must create the conditions, and the work is being done already by the Ukrainian government, so that all the people who left Ukraine would be willing to come to a safe and prosperous Ukraine.
Ми маємо берегти молодь не лише від війни, а і від їхньої зневіри.
We must protect our youth not only from the war, but also from despair.
Ми маємо визнавати права людини не як абстракцію, а як основоположний принцип нашого майбутнього. Це є основою.
And we must uphold the human rights not just as an abstract idea, but as the key foundation of our future.
І, до речі, безпека – це не лише про зброю.
And also, security and safety is not only about weapons.
Це про довіру, справедливість, стабільність.
It's about trust, stability and justice.
Це про інституції, які працюють, і про лідерів, які відповідають за свої слова своїми вчинками.
It's about the functioning institutions and the leaders who actually turn their words into action.
І наш сьогоднішній діалог має йти далі. Від завершення війни до побудови справедливого і тривалого миру.
And our dialogue today must go beyond just talking about ending the war. We must be talking about just and lasting peace.
Разом із нашими партнерами – це США, це Європа і всіма, хто підтримує свободу, ми можемо створити світ, де сила права переважає над правом сили.
Together with our partners, and I'm talking about the United States, the European Union, and everybody who supports freedom, we can create a world where the rule of law prevails over the rule of force.
Я переконаний, що економічна стабільність – це не менш важливий інструмент захисту, ніж будь-яка інша форма оборони.
I'm convinced that economic stability is one of the important forms of defense, same as important as the military.
Щоб досягти процвітання, ми маємо інвестувати в прозорість, підтримувати підприємців і цінувати саме людський капітал.
And if we want prosperity, we must invest into transparency, we must support entrepreneurship, and we must value the human capital.
На сьогодні сильна економіка – це фундамент сильної держави.
Strong economy is the foundation of a strong state.
Але економіка не може існувати без людей. Саме тому ми прагнемо повернути віру саме тим людям, хто виїхав, хто сумнівається і хто втомився. Нам треба вони в Україні. Їм треба повертатись.
But of course, economy cannot progress without people. That's why we're investing so much effort into convincing the people who left that they should return. This is our priority.
І ви знаєте, я звертаюсь до нашої молоді, до талантів українських, які зараз перебувають за кордоном. Україна потребує вас.
And they always turn to the young people, to the young Ukrainians abroad, and I underline that we need you. Ukraine needs you back.
цей час ми працюємо над тим, щоб зробити нашу країну простором можливостей, місцем, де інновації процвітають, а інвестори бачать не ризики, а перспективу свого розвитку і розвитку нашої держави.
And we are trying now to make Ukraine as a place of opportunity where innovation thrives and investors see not risk but rather a potential.
Сьогодні громадяни України чітко артикулюють запит. Потрібні мирні умови для розвитку, умови, де бізнес зростає, а молодь бачить майбутнє саме в Україні.
Today, the Ukrainian citizens are articulating a very clear demand: a country with the conditions where the business can prosper and when the young people can see their future.
Але ми не прагнемо і не закликаємо до революції. Революції руйнують усе на своєму шляху.
But we are not calling for any sort of revolution because revolutions are ruining everything on their path.
Ми прагнемо і пропонуємо еволюційний шлях розвитку. Розумний, системний, але безкомпромісний.
We seek rather evolution, a way of development that is thoughtful, systemic, but still uncompromising.
Сьогодні Україна стоїть перед історичним шансом.
Today, Ukraine is actually on its historic crossroads.
Не просто відбудувати зруйноване, а створити нову модель держави. Сучасну, ефективну, відкриту.
Not just to rebuild what has been destroyed, but to create a new model of the state, modern, efficient and open.
Але цей шанс залежить від здатності суспільства і політиків діяти спільно. Це в тому числі та єдність, про яку сьогодні казав Марк Грін і про яку казали всі ми – єдність.
But whether it's going to be possible to deliver depends deeply on the ability of politicians and the society to cooperate, to be together. And this is kind of unity that was mentioned in today's discussion, and I'm standing behind this. I support this idea.
Так, на сьогодні перед Україною і перед всіма нашими партнерами виклики дуже великі.
Of course, both Ukraine and our partners are facing tremendous challenges.
Але досвід останніх років довів, ми здатні подолати найскладніші перешкоди. Питання лише в тому, чи скористаємося ми цим моментом.
But the experience of the past several years has demonstrated that we are able to overcome the toughest obstacles. The question is whether we are going to take this chance.
Шановні друзі,
Dear friends,
ми вдячні Сполученим Штатам за допомогою. Допомога, яка була зброєю, санкцією, гуманітарною підтримкою і вірою в нас.
Dear friends, we're extremely grateful to the United States for the assistance and support in arms, in sanctions, in humanitarian assistance, and also in faith, which means believing in Ukraine.
Але ми також розуміємо, ніхто не зробить нашу роботу за нас.
But we also fully understand that nobody is going to do our job instead of us.
Ми розуміємо, що майбутнє саме в наших руках, в руках українців.
We understand that the future is in the hands of Ukrainians.
Сьогодні ми повинні бути єдиними – політики, суспільство і бізнес.
Today we must be united, politicians, society and business.
Це на сьогодні тест на нашу зрілість.
And this is the test for our maturity today.
Ми будуємо країну, де мир не мрія, а норма.
We are building a country where peace is not a dream but a norm.
Де молодь не їде, а повертається.
Where young people are not leaving but returning.
Це наш шанс.
This is our chance.
І це шанс для всього світу довести, що свобода перемагає.
And this is the chance for the whole world to prove that freedom wins.
І я повторюсь, ми маємо скористатися цим шансом, ми ним скористаємося.
And I'm going to repeat myself, we need to seize this chance, to take it, and we are going to take it.
Я вірю, що з Божою поміччю та спільною роботою ми обов'язково впораємося.
I truly believe that with God's help and with joint work, we will succeed.
Ми відновимо нашу землю.
We will rebuild our land.
І ми збудуємо нову Україну, країну безпеки, гідності і прогресу.
And we will build a new Ukraine, a country of security, dignity and progress.
Слава Україні! Дякую за увагу! Дякую за увагу!
Thank you for your
Thank you for those powerful words. Now, Matt, I'd like to turn to you to talk about your work at Georgetown and how it relates to Ukraine.
Terrific, thank you. Dobry ranok, boker tov, shalom, good morning. I'm also pleased to be here, and I'll start briefly on a personal note. I spent a couple of years in Israel in the late 80s and early 90s, mostly on kibbutzim, and then spent most of my professional career in the business world, working in the former Soviet Union and, of course, Ukraine, where my company had a joint venture. We did a lot of business in the railway sector. And today, as I'm going to be talking to you about, I'm at Georgetown and excited to share with you an exciting program that's being developed there. But what I wanted to say on a personal note was, I have to say that earlier, I'm not sure I felt, sensed, or really intellectually understood the connection between Israel, the United States, and Ukraine that clearly I see today. My favorite, or one of my favorite Ukrainian journalists is Vitaly Portnikov, who is constantly on Israeli media outlets, and he's making this point rather vigorously that, you know, these three countries and the ideas behind them and their situation, we really are in one camp. So just from my own life, I'm seeing new things, and I'm very happy, therefore, to be in this room that unites Israel, Ukraine, and the United States. So what I'm here to speak to you about briefly, and then maybe in the question and answers, I'd be happy to talk about the business and economic and maybe U.S. Business interests in Ukrainian reconstruction. But I'm here to tell you that at Georgetown University, at the request of First Lady Zelenska, who, when in Washington about a year ago in July, had requested that Georgetown take up the call and establish a Ukraine studies program. Now, there are other Ukraine studies programs in the U.S., maybe most notably at Harvard, where the great historian Sergei Plokhy is the head. But as I'm going to quickly tell you, the vision for Georgetown's program is a little bit different. So as I understand it, the First Lady has a global initiative to establish Ukrainian studies programs in several places around the globe, and here in the U.S., the hub would be at Georgetown. I can. As I said, Georgetown has taken up this call, and just a couple of weeks ago, and the ambassador spoke at it, and certainly Katerina was there. We had a launch event on May 6th by video. President Clinton spoke, Secretary Clinton, as well as First Lady Zelenska, Ambassador Makarova, and other dignitaries spoke at this event. And the only thing I want to read to you here is the three goals of the program, which I'll explain why maybe, or not maybe, why they do differentiate the vision for this program. So the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown is arguably the most prestigious school, not only here in the U.S., but globally in international relations and foreign service. So the goals of the program, and the idea is to endow a chair in Ukraine studies and then to build a program around that, is to educate the next generation, not of academics, so I'm sure there'll be a few along the way, of U.S. policymakers, international leaders, and global change makers with a greater understanding and appreciation of Ukraine, including in the fields of international relations and security, economic reconstruction, the theme of this panel, and democracy building. Second goal, provide Ukraine with a respected seat or another respected seat, as we have Ambassador Herbst next to me, at the table in Washington's academic and public policy ecosystem. As you understand, this is a town that makes a lot of important decisions, and there are a lot of events like this where Ukraine's voice needs to be heard. And then on the reverse side, a third objective of this vision is to enrich learning at Georgetown and the wider academic community with an important new voice. I think we would all acknowledge that Ukraine's voice has not always been heard. I'm a perfect example of that. I went to school in the 90s, did my MA at Georgetown, and it was the Soviet Union and Russia that had most of the focus. And I'm doing my penance now for that earlier. It's just the way it was back then. So we understand we're in a new period, and I think that by studying and developing our expertise in Ukraine, we not only strengthen Ukraine, but we further our own understandings and capabilities in international relations and security. So I'm going to be hoping that a few of you will be interested in learning more, and we can chat about it during the schmoozing. And if anybody, we've just started this fundraising. It's a big ask. So if anyone here is interested in becoming a donor, financial donor, I'd be pleased to put you in contact with the advancement office at Georgetown, and they would be pleased to talk with you. So anyway, those were my thoughts on the Georgetown program. It will have an economic reconstruction component to it. And again, if during questions and answers there's questions or thoughts on how U.S. business is looking at Ukraine, I'd be happy to offer my thoughts.
Thank you very much. Now, Ambassador Herbst, we've heard some of your thoughts on the political, but I'd like you to tie in any additional thoughts on this topic of a vision for the future after war. Katya mentioned earlier this minerals agreement. How does that fit in, and what do you see for the U.S. and Ukraine together economically? Any other points you want to add in? And I can give you my mic if needed.
Thank you. Before I answer your question, which I will do, I want to put in a plug for this Georgetown initiative. And I'm going to give you a very important national security reason. Russian studies in the United States were really given a strong push as a result of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. There was a wave of prominent Russian intellectuals who fled Russia. In fact, there was a ship of geniuses, which took a lot of them out. I think it was the late teens or the very early 1920s. And a lot of them wound up in the United States, including two first-rate historians, George Vernadsky, who arrived and began to teach at Yale. And I always get this name slightly wrong, so forgive me if I don't get it right now. An equivalent scholar, Mikhail Karpov or Karpovich, I forget, at Harvard. Now, they were excellent historians in the Russian tradition. And there is what I call Russian imperial history, which essentially teaches that all the quote-unquote little people on Russia's periphery are naturally part of the Russian political enterprise, the Russian Empire, the Soviet Empire. And virtually all Russian history taught in the United States since the 20s has taught Russian imperial history as objective history. And that's how I learned history, I might add. I was at Georgetown in the early 70s, got a terrific education, but that part of the education was not as complete as it should have been. And all of my colleagues, including my colleagues who made up a very strong part of the U.S. Foreign Service throughout the Cold War, learned that history too. Now, I only understood that I had been mistaught as I prepared to go to Ukraine as ambassador in 2003. And I wanted to read a Ukrainian historian on Ukraine's history. So I read an important but extraordinarily dry book by a guy named Rest Subtelny. And I remember fighting with the book for the first 150 pages. Because all the things he was telling me was not consistent with what I had been taught and believed literally for decades. And suddenly it dawned on me. I was reading the Ukrainian view as opposed to the Russian view of Eastern European history. The light went on. Sadly, many of my colleagues in the Foreign Service and a largest number of former US ambassadors to Russia have yet to this day understand what I just told you. And it starts in the universities here. That's why this initiative is so important. And I'll tell you a story just to underscore this. There's a wonderful American diplomatic reporter, long retired, named Marvin Kalb. He has actually written excellent books on American foreign policy. But he was taught by Professor Karpovich at Harvard in the 50s, and he was in the PhD program before he turned to journalism. Very talented man, whom I respect. But he learned Russian imperial history, and at his very advanced age has had no reason, although I thought I might have given him one, to reconsider. I shouldn't say I, but my program might have given him one. He wrote a weak book on Putin's war in Ukraine that came out in 2015, which, because he imbibed Russian imperial history as true history, colored his approach. Overly sympathetic to the Russian worldview that Russia had been invaded from the west and the north over centuries, which is true, but never taking into account that, as Putin likes to say, and others like to say, Russia knows no borders. And as Henry Kissinger, who did not quite get this right either, although truly a great man, wrote in his book Diplomacy, I remember reading this in the mid to late 90s, that every day since Ivan III took over as Tsar of Russia in the late 15th century, the Russian borders expanded. It was 100 square kilometers, 100 square miles, every day since then. And so again, American diplomats have not understood this. And we see this in some of the more fatuous statements made by President Obama. Not Biden, he understood it, although his policy was weak. And the current administration, including in particular our special envoy for Russia. And that's a serious problem. So that's why this initiative is very important. What Serhiy Plokhy did at Harvard is critical. I forgot, this is such an important subject, I didn't finish on Cal. So he wrote that book. We panned it in our twice a week newsletter, Ukraine Alert. Now, it just so happened that one of the junior reporters who was taken under the wing of the doyen of the diplomatic reporters in the early 80s was my boss, Fred Kemp, the president of the Atlantic Council, who had been a junior reporter for the Wall Street Journal. So Marvin Kalb called Fred and said, "What's this hit job you guys did written by some Russian nationalist on my book?" It was wonderful. An ethnic Russian wrote that review. So we were able to dispose of that pretty easily. But one last footnote to this. Again, I respect Kalb. He's done a lot of great work in his career. So he wrote a book, maybe 3 years later, on his early years as a professional. So I said, I'll read that book and write a nice review. And so I was going along through it, page 70, page 80, and suddenly this happened. He was a book reviewer as a young journalist because he was working for NBC, I think, whatever it was. And he was actually a scholar, right? He'd become an almost PhD. And he wrote a book written by a Ukrainian professor at Columbia whose name escapes me. And he pans his work as of an extreme Ukrainian nationalist, which of course is a very Russian imperial point of view. So I emailed Serhiy Plokhy, who you referred to, the great historian at Harvard. I said, Serhiy, what can you tell me about this guy? He said, this guy was a pathfinder in Ukrainian studies. I couldn't write that review of the books. I'd have had to slam him again. So this just underscores the problem. Okay, now to your question, Shelby. Look, we have a very, very energetic program at the Atlantic Council at the Eurasia Center, essentially pursuing, promoting American interest in Eastern Europe by advocating for strong American and Western policy to stop Russian aggression in Ukraine and to help Ukraine become the democratic, market-oriented, free society that manifestly wants to be. And since there's going to be no reconstruction of Ukraine unless Ukraine wins this war in some fashion, I say in some fashion because I said earlier, Trump's proposal could work for a more than satisfactory outcome, although not a beautiful outcome. But because this is in doubt, we spend most of our time focusing on the war. Also, I have a history, background, dealing with reconstruction of destroyed societies. And I know when efforts are serious in this field and when they're not. And the international effort thus far to address the reconstruction of Ukraine is strong on hot air, weak on actual achievements. Having said that, we pay some attention to that. But first we have to make sure that war turns out right. I have no doubt that once we reach that point, and chances are not 100%, but they're better, well over 50% that will happen. Because I think American policy, after futzing around with this and that, will move in the right direction. Then there will be quality attention paid to the reconstruction of Ukraine. Once the game is truly on. And when that happens, and again, I think that day will probably, but not definitely arrive. One, international resource will be available. I'm now talking about public resources. Two, if we're smart, and we can't count on being smart, some resources will come from those frozen Russian state assets, the 300 billion or so that are hanging around the international financial system. More assets than that will come from the private sector because big business in the United States and elsewhere understands there are profits to be made. Some assets will be found in Ukraine, albeit capital less than from the West. But human capital in Ukraine is serious, despite the great damage done by the war. We're seeing that as Ukraine has run circles around the Russians in applying the most advanced relevant technology to the battlefield. And I'll be discreet, but major American businessmen have tried to steal Ukrainian IPR, and I'll be no more explicit than that. I don't like lawsuits. And the Ukrainians, because they're not dummies, realized that when they arrived in Ukraine a few years ago as philanthropists. All of these are reasons to be optimistic once the war is behind Ukraine. So I remain, in a very frustrated way, cautiously optimistic about the future of Ukraine, and therefore American interests in Eastern Europe and beyond. Because as my friend Steve Biegun, the former Deputy Secretary of State during the Trump administration, says, there's not one national security challenge facing the United States anywhere in the world that will not be better for us if Putin loses or is defeated or prevented from taking control of Ukraine. And that's absolutely right. So there's reason for us to be optimistic. Oh, by the way, this is important too. When I have this relatively rosy picture of what will come in Ukraine following successful defense of Ukraine's sovereignty, I am taking into account the still very large problem of corruption. That has not disappeared, including under the latest president of Ukraine. Some steps have been taken and they should not be dismissed. They're real. I don't have the exact number in my head because I didn't think I'd be talking on the subject this morning. But Ukraine has moved up like 25 or 26 places in the Transparency International Index of Corruption. I think they're like in the low 100s. They used to be in the mid 100s, which is where Russia is, by the way. So that's positive, but still not good enough, even for government work. And you can be sure that problem will be addressed as Ukraine's expedited admission to the EU takes place, with also some help from the United States.
Thank you very much. So I've got more questions for them, but I also get to talk to Ambassador Herbst a lot. So are there any questions from the audience? You answered everything. Oh, we've got a question back there. Please just give your name as well.
Hi, my name's Rabbi Wasserman. I have a question. I'm not sure if you appreciate the contrarian point of view. I've heard this morning, but if someone would stand in front of you and say, you know what, Ukraine is not part of NATO, number one. I'm sorry, my voice is...
I apologize. Let's say you have someone with a contrarian point of view, and I do have a degree in international relations I have to disclose. So let's say someone said Ukraine is not part of NATO. It's not in the United States' national interest. They're partially isolationist, but the flavor of the political will is not there in the populace. They say, you know what, they had a good effort, and in order to sound a little rough, and I apologize for this, you'd say we got the Soviet Union on its back. Thank you, Reagan. And now we're trying to put them on the grave, and it's not working. They're a nuclear power, and it's not worth the fight. And you don't want to test the fact that they would bring nuclear arms to bear. How would you answer that?
Piece of cake. We, right now, and I mentioned this earlier, an important reason why people fundamentally don't understand the critical stakes for the United States in Eastern Europe is that after 9/11, we pursued fecklessly the war on terrorism. And we tried to achieve results in Iraq and Afghanistan in the area of nation building, something I'm familiar with, that we never could achieve. And people learned the wrong lesson from that failure. Yes, we should have learned from that failure not to go into a country that was so alien to the principles that make up modern democracy and think we can move them to become a modern democracy. Our efforts in nation building in Iraq and Afghanistan, and then later in Libya, were destined to fail. Destined to fail. And then we began to misapply that in Ukraine. I can't tell you how many debates I had with that contrarian view when they started by saying, we had this awful policy in the greater Middle East. I said, tell me something I don't know. And I explained to them that Ukraine is not Afghanistan. When the Taliban began their big surge in the summer of 2021, what did Ashraf Ghani do, the president of Kabul? He took the money and he ran. When Joe Biden told Zelensky, get out of town, I'll help you. What did Zelensky say? I don't need a ride, I need weapons. And Ukraine fought, and has fought since 2014, as valiantly for its sovereignty and territorial integrity as Israel has fought since 1947. Now, you mentioned nukes. I'm glad you did. It's amazing how a bad idea, when it's presented by one part of the American political spectrum, is adopted by the other part of the American political spectrum. Until Joe Biden, not once in America's diplomatic history did senior American officials say, in a confrontation with a nuclear peer, that we could not take basic steps to defend our security because the other guys have nukes and we may get hit by nukes. Kennedy did not do that during the Berlin Wall crisis. He did not do that during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Biden and his team have said that multiple times. They have been intimidated by Putin's nuclear threats. It's amazing. On the other side of the political spectrum, this became dogma. Tucker Carlson raises it. Laura Ingraham raises it. J.D. Vance raises it. Don Jr. raises it. And they're the guys who say the Democrats are weak. And they've adopted the specific most weak part of Biden's foreign policy. This is not Reagan. Peace through strength. This is appeasement. Now, coming back to American interests in Ukraine. What you need to do, if you are responsible for American national security, is understand both the capacity of your adversaries. So the Russians are the only pure nuclear power we face. They don't have much of an economy. They don't have much of a conventional military, as Ukraine has proved, but they sure have nukes. Although if their conventional military is any example, and maybe their nuclear capacity is less than we think it is, but we can't assume that. But you also have to understand their ambitions, their objectives. And Putin, other senior Russian officials have made clear that their ambition is to knock us off our place in the global security and economic system. They intend not, if they win in Ukraine, if they take effective political control of Ukraine, they're not going to stop there. Do you know what happened in Estonia? 3 days after Obama visited in the late summer of 2014 to reassure the Balts that don't be paranoid about what Putin's doing. This was 6 months after the war in Ukraine began. What did the Russians do? They kidnapped an Estonian security official and brought him to Russia. Do you think the Balts were reassured? If you understand that Putin is going to go beyond Ukraine, and you've let him intimidate you, the United States, out of giving Ukraine the weapons to stop him, what do you think Putin's going to think about the Article 5 guarantee to the Baltic states? And if you think that Putin's not going farther, look at the activities, or rather the decisions made by the people whose national interests are on the line. Sweden and Finland were doctrinally neutral nations for many decades. What happened after the big invasion by Putin of Ukraine? They suddenly got up and joined NATO. And by the way, Putin threatened nukes if that happened. As our colleague said in the panel earlier today, we've seen Putin threaten nukes 15 or 20 times, and every time the red line he laid down to put a nuke against it was crossed, what happened? As they say in Russian, nichivo. As they say in, is it Yiddish? Bupkis? Right? Bupkis. So I love debating the so-called contrarians. They don't have legs to stand on. And John Mearsheimer, a great scholar, has disgraced himself over this issue. By the way, I had the opportunity to appear on the same panel with him in a conservative audience to Mount Pelerin Society 18 months ago. To my surprise, I got more applause than he did. That's because there were a lot of Europeans in the audience.
Thank you, Ambassador Herbst. We've got a question right here.
I'll say a couple of words before I ask the question.
And please introduce
Everything I
yourself.
worked with today,
Please introduce yourself as well. It was working. I think we could hear you.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'll say a few comments before I ask the question. Everything I've heard today and other meetings I go to for Ukraine remind me of the aspirations for South Vietnam when Kissinger was negotiating his hope for peace. And we know what happened in South Vietnam. We know what happened in '53 when the French signed the peace with South Vietnam. It fell apart. We signed the peace, and what I could consider is that Ho Chi Minh played Kissinger like the fiddle. He got what he wanted. He got a pause. He got us out. North Vietnam rearmed. They reattacked and took South Vietnam. And they proved what I keep standing on, that peace only counts with total victory. World War I, World War II, and Vietnam proved that. Unfortunately, in Vietnam, the wrong side won, but they got peace. In Korea, there's no peace. Afghanistan, there's no peace. Iraq, there's no peace. Israel, there's no peace. Why? Because there's no total victory. And all these things you guys said here today, you think it's going to work, all this work about economy, building economy, rebuilding Ukraine. If 5 years from now, Russia repeats what it does, and it'll be more ready, it won't be caught off guard, and it'll be faster. So what do you think is going to happen?
Matt, do you want to try that one?
Yeah, probably Ambassador Herbst would be better. A couple of thoughts. Recently read an old Ed Lutwak piece about you sometimes want to let wars go to their logical conclusion. But I would say a couple of things as it relates to what I spoke about. You know, obviously what we're trying to do at Georgetown is to provide that knowledge and that teaching that will give Ukraine greater strength, our own decision makers greater understanding. So again, I would pitch the importance of what we're trying to do. I'm going to defer to the others. My own belief is that, yes, of course, I hear you, what you're saying. I don't see a pathway to going to Moscow. So if you can't go to Moscow, you're going to have to figure out something in between. It's imperfect, and we're going to have to learn. Again, Georgetown would hopefully be part of that process on how to navigate that sort of situation going forward. So I obviously take your point. It's cleaner and it's better if you could wipe out this regime in Russia. But until that happens from an internal process, unless you're going to Moscow, I think we're going to have to learn how to navigate imperfect conditions.
Vadym, do you want to add anything? All right, Ambassador Herbst, why don't you give...
Я просто хочу. Я можу пару реплік сказати з приводу, наприклад, мінеральної угоди.
I just can say something about the raw materials deal.
Дивіться, це про економіку, так, дійсно. Це допомога у розвідці, у видобуванні, допомога Україні стати на ноги. Це про економіку.
So this is of course about economy. So it's how do we explore them, how do we extract them, and how Ukrainian economy gets better back on the track.
Але не тільки про економіку.
But it's not only about economy.
Це про безпеку.
It's about security.
Тому що таким чином ми захищаємо за допомогою партнерів наші мінеральні корисні копалини від агресора і від корупції, яку ми долаємо і успішно долаємо, йдемо прогресивно, але вона ще поки є.
And just because of this agreement, with the help of our partners, we protect our mineral resources not only from the aggressor, but also from corruption. Of course, we are fighting it, but still there is some space for progress.
І разом відбудуємо Україну.
And we can rebuild Ukraine together.
Thank you. Ambassador Herbst, final thoughts?
Look, it's certainly true that the arrangements made for getting out of Afghanistan, which was the right decision, but the arrangements made for doing it were weak and ultimately disastrous. As I already mentioned, our adventure in Iraq was a serious mistake, the way we did it. What you say about Vietnam, I think many people would agree with you, including with a close colleague of Shelby and mine, General Wes Clark. But it's also true that there's also another interpretation, which to my mind is equally plausible. The arrangements that Kissinger made for the peace could have achieved a stable South Vietnamese government if Congress had not pulled the legs out of the Nixon administration's policies in terms of Americans' weapons supply to the South. I frankly disagree with you on Korea. Korea was ultimately a not quite satisfying success. South Korea is not just independent, but it is a thriving economy, a real power, who has positive influence, not just in East Asia, but into Central Asia. Now, of course, that required American troops on the ground to this day. And that's something my colleague at the Atlantic Council, Deborah Kagan, points out in discussing a possible outcome to Russia's war in Ukraine. And that's why the Trump idea of European troops going into Ukraine is a sound one. And hopefully, if this idea, which Europeans are pursuing seriously, will ultimately involve some form of American guarantee to the Europeans. But we can't count on that, but this is plausible. So there is, in our history and in the current circumstances, the materials that could lead to a stable peace in Ukraine, provided serious pressure is put on the Kremlin, both military in form of arms, European troops, and economic.
Thank you. Thank you to our panelists for all of your thoughts and your insight, and thank you for the very interesting questions. Sounds like we have more to discuss in the future. And with that, over to you, Katja.
So feel free to ask your questions, our speakers, and to meet your friends. And as Rabbi and Pastor said, it's always good to meet new person because as I remember, Lubavitch Rebbe is like big person with wisdom. Big Rebbe said that sometimes you need direct person, which you need direct now. So maybe it's a good point to meet somebody also today till 2 p.m. And thank you so much for your contributions. Feel free to visit our website, Institute for Democracy and Development, Polita, and also websites of our partner, Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast, Jewish Orthodox Chamber of Commerce. Thank you so much for our media team. They do great work, and have a good day. We are here and we open for different type of cooperations.